look at the real world evidence of what is happening with climate change now on the planet, and try to work towards mitigation and adapting. So it's not an easy role. And as you can imagine, it's getting busier and busier, unfortunately. And I'm going to go through very briefly a quick excerpt from some barriers to adaptation and climate action in Ireland. So I don't work with any one group. I work with a number of environmental NGOs and activist groups, as well as working with policymakers and with private companies. Because really, from my perspective, we have to have all hands on deck. This is an emergency, and unfortunately, we're not necessarily seeing it being treated as an emergency. So I have a bit of a different approach to this, because I don't believe as a scientist we've been doing a particularly good job in terms of throwing lots of data at people and overwhelming them. And I know from my own perspective, I was a business executive for years, so I approached this very differently in terms of how to frame this, and then trying to create a safe space to talk about climate change. So I talk more from the life experience that I have had going through various different events and working with different communities. So perhaps if we can go on to the next slide, if that's okay, please, Ian. And I just wanted to start with this. So I wanted to bring a voice to climate discussions that often are not heard. And, you know, in the climate crisis, a lot of the time we feel that these are adult discussions that need to happen and that children should be protected from these conversations. I'm going to share with you the voice of these 3 young girls who, they're my godchildren. So I have Naona is the child in the middle, and I'm going to be sharing her lived experience of what climate change has meant for her. And the idea behind this is so that we can understand the gravitas of the situation. And this is a picture that they drew for me when I was out for a walk one day, and I came back and I found this picture on my balcony window. I've lived in Switzerland for the past 10 years, and I've just moved back to Ireland. And you can't see in this picture, but there's glaciers and the Swiss Alps out behind where the children are standing. And the reason they painted me this picture was because we had just been through something called an atmospheric river event. It had been a heat wave in Switzerland. This was 2019 during the summer. We'd had a heat wave, then we had an earthquake, then we had an atmospheric river, which is where the volume of water that fell from the sky was the equivalent of the volume of water that you would typically see in a river. And it's not something I had ever experienced before, but of course, as an environmental scientist, I had read about it. And when I experienced this, it opened up a whole new level of urgency for me. And apologies, my voice is a little bit going because I have COVID, unfortunately, but I'll try to keep this as quick as possible. So essentially, our children in our village started to experience the climate crisis firsthand. And they had a lot of questions for me, a lot of very, very difficult questions. And they asked me to share those questions with the people that I met. So that's why I'm opening up our conversation with this. And essentially their question was, do we rescue ourselves? Do we rescue ourselves because the adults haven't told us what we're supposed to do? And that was one of the most confronting questions that I have ever had in my career. When they asked me that question, it was as they were going to bed one evening when they had experienced a mudslide event that cut off their town from the rest of the valley and the rest of Switzerland. There's only one road into Engelberg in the Swiss Alps where these children live. So they couldn't go to summer school. They couldn't go to their camps that they had booked. And they were very, very scared at what they were seeing because the sky was literally opening up and the atmospheric river that came was very, very scary, even to us adults. And of course, this was happening in the Swiss Alps. As the water made its way down the riverbanks and down to lower valley communities, they started to flood and there were evacuation orders put out by the Swiss government. Lake Lucerne started to flood, which is at the lower end of that water system. And that lake flows out to the River Rhine. And within a week, we saw the flash flooding events that took 120 lives in Germany. We all knew that those lives could have been the lives of the children in this photograph. So when they start to ask questions like, do we rescue ourselves? It started to really open up a huge, mind-blowing perspective from me. And when they started drawing pictures like this, you can see there's pandas bleeding to death in this picture. They've dropped, you can't see it in this photograph, but on the floor in front of it, there's panda blood having been dripped all over my apartment floor. And they started to ask me as they were going to bed, what do we do? How do we get out if the mudslide comes to our bedroom? And how will you be able to rescue us? How will you be able to get up the stairs? Will we leave without you? And of course, I had to say to them, yes. Yes, you need to leave without me. And I realized what a disservice I had done through my climate policy making and as a sustainable development scientist, because there is such a huge gap, even in my own severity denialism, I called it, where I would constantly push to the back of my mind that this isn't as bad as we think it is, and we've got time to fix this. We've still got lots of time. And as you can see, we don't have any time left for talking. We don't have any time left for climate policies that push out to 30 years' time. The time is now. And their other question to me was, did you know our planet was dying, Auntie Naomi? And this is the 9-year-old Naona who's in the middle of this picture. When a 9-year-old asks you, did you know the planet was dying? I can't explain the emotions that go through your mind. And I had to say, yes, I knew this was happening. And she asked me if that's why I had changed my job into working in climate full-time. And I said, yes. And she said, and did all the other adults know that our planet was dying? And I had to say, yes, we've known for a long time. And she said, so what have you been doing? And I frantically searched for words. And I started telling her about the policy making and the white papers and all of those things that we do as scientists and as people in power. And I said, you know, that's why I got rid of my car. That's why I cycle. And I said, that's why people are recycling. Excuse me. And she said, cycling and recycling. Cycling and recycling. She cut me off. That's all you could think of. That's all you could think of. And it was a defining moment for me where I realized that nothing I had done would ever be enough in terms of what these children are going through and what we're all going through. And I decided then that I would change the way I approached everything and try to radically collaborate with any group that I could in terms of anyone trying to shift the status quo. Because of course, this isn't an environmental problem. This is a socio-cultural problem. This stems from a problem of overconsumption and greed and an economic system that isn't fit for purpose. And the children's final question to me was, why couldn't adults be the adults? Why do we have to tell you as children what you should be doing? And that question really floored me. And I've got to be honest, I completely lost my emotional resolve when she asked me that question. And I said to her, we've been very silly and we haven't been very brave, and we all need to be very brave. And I said, what could I do to help now? And she said, well, I don't get invited to your climate club, she calls it. I had a group based in the town who were a community group. And she said, I would just like to ask all of the adults if they could please be adults now. And we need them to be brave, and we need them to do their best. My teacher says, all you can do is your best. And I thought that was so well put in terms of, we know the gravitas of the situation. We know the climate science. Anybody who opens a newspaper can see the level of ecological collapse that we are experiencing on this planet. But we often have that neurological dissonance between everything. And really, it summed up all of the research that we had done in terms of sociocultural barriers. Because even I had put up that sociocultural barrier of, this will never happen to my people. This will never come to my door. This will never affect my family. And yet it did 2 years ago. And the children still talk to me about it, and they ask for updates on what I've been doing and have I been telling people their story. So it's interesting how I'm now reporting into particularly the little girl in the middle. She's 11 now, and she asks me for updates. And I think it's a great way to approach this conversation in terms of having courageous conversations. None of us can turn back time. None of us can change what's happened, but we can try to build towards a livable future. And while that is very, very difficult, and it means we have to change everything about the way we live, I think it's worth it just to have been able to have that conversation with them, where I was able to say, I am trying my best and I will keep trying my best. So that's their words, and they're often not heard. Let's move on to what that means in terms of reality. We've all seen IPCC reports at this stage, and I'm not going to go through that in any great detail because I'm aware that we only have a very short amount of time today. But effectively, there is a countdown clock that goes to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was the Paris Agreement maximum limit that we should be going to in terms of our global temperature increase. And when we reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is a point of runaway climate change, as we call it. And what does that mean, runaway climate change? It's the point at where we can't slow things down anymore. There's not an awful lot that we can do in terms of adaptation. And for people like me, this is the timeline that I'm working towards. But the problem is this timeline gets shorter every day when there are things like wars, NATO's emissions are not included in this timeline because we don't have access as scientists to those emission details. We don't have access to the details that aren't disclosed by governments around the world. So I think this is very sobering when we look at the climate clock and we realize, okay, there is an absolute timeline for us here. And this isn't meant to scare anyone. This isn't meant to upset anyone. It's the idea behind it is, if you have a time frame in mind, and I'm a project manager by background as well, if you don't know your time frame, it's very hard to work towards any kind of an output or any kind of a goal. So the idea behind this is, if we have time frames, we can then understand the gravitas and the urgency of the situation. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm not, as I said before, I'm not going to go through all the details in terms of planetary tipping points and overwhelming people, because I think you all know it. And if you're anything like me, you might tip into severity denialism, or, you know, go to another place and start thinking of something else, because it's easier to do that, right? It's easier to think, I can't handle this. This is so difficult and it's so confronting, because I have to talk about my own mortality as well as yours. But I think the one thing that summed this entire piece up for me was when I was at COP26. And Frans Timmermans, who was the vice president of sustainable finance at the time, I believe was his title, don't quote me on that. He had a moment where he just, you know, we're all given these speeches and we're all given these data points to talk about. And we've been doing this for a very long time and reciting these figures for a very long time. But the message isn't quite getting across to people, I don't think, in terms of what this means for us now. And I felt Frans Timmermans did something so clever, but it was as a result of him just being so emotionally drained. And many of you may have seen this clip, but basically he just took out his phone and he held up his phone and he said, the picture on the front of this screen is of my grandson. And this was sent to me this morning as I was walking in here by my son. And my grandson is a year old. And he said, by the time this child is 29 years old, he will have to fight other human beings for food and water in Europe. Now let's just think about that for a minute. Where are you going to be in 30 years' time? How old will you be? I'm going to be 71. Are you going to fight a 71-year-old for food and water? Because I'm not prepared to fight any of you. So if we don't change this scientific trajectory now, and I mean now, then we really don't have any kind of a future in my mind. And I think that's the way we have to speak about this now, is to try to get away from the percentage points and the tipping points and to talk about what does this mean for you and me? And that's a very difficult conversation to start having. But when I was asked, what is the role of universities in the climate crisis? For me, universities have been centers of knowledge. But we have to look at the wisdom that's within people already. We have to start asking questions rather than telling people numbers, and often communicating in scientific language that doesn't mean anything to anyone. So from my perspective, it's very, very easy to get overwhelmed and I think that's where we have to just try to keep thinking of the changes that we can make and the power that we have personally. And I keep hearing my godchild in the background saying, I just need you to do your best. I won't be able to save the planet. None of us can do that. We know that. But we may be able to preserve part of humanity. We may be able to slow things down. And to me, that's what this is about. It's not about the outcome, it's about the process. And it's about me being able to say to the people around me who I love, I did my best. I did everything that I could. And I hope you will also try to do your best. And don't get me wrong, sometimes doing my best is sitting on the sofa and having a cup of tea and just not being able to take action, because there are days where this gets way too much. And I think we really need to acknowledge that too. But the one thing that I have found is that action is the best antidote to despair. And by taking action, and particularly by working with our young people who are not afraid to say this kind of stuff. I mean, they call out civilizatory collapse with me all the time, whereas I have been avoiding those words for a very long time. And I think the one most motivating leader that I have met in this was a woman called Sheila Jakababota. And again, it was at COP26, and she said these words as she was introducing President Barack Obama onto stage. And I was in a speaker panel following COP26 with our Minister, Eamon Ryan, with Brian Ledden, who's the chair of the Joint Oireachtas Committee for Climate Action, and two other government advisors. And a question came from the speaker panel, you know, what did you find to be the most motivating thing? And I really struggled, because I had seen a lot of oil lobbying. I had seen a lot of people who I didn't feel should be at COP. And it was business as usual with a lot of people. But this one woman gave me such motivation. So I'm going to recount her words now, and then I'm going to hand over to the amazing activists who have joined me today. These are Sheila Jakababota's words as she introduced President Obama onto stage. She said, "Don't wait for any of these leaders. These are not the leaders that you need." And she recited the Hopi elders. We are the ones that we have been waiting for. We need to take the wisdom of our elders, and we need to combine it with the energy of our young people. We are the leaders we have been waiting for. The time is now. And with that, it's time for me to hand over to the next speaker. So I believe, oh, and yes, just if you do need, sorry, I forgot this slide was there, but this is basically real world evidence of climate change right now. This was a Met Office government briefing last year in July, where these temperatures were expected by the year 2050. These temperatures were broken within a week of this presentation being made. A state of emergency was declared in the UK. I believe 8 MPs attended that meeting with numerous climate scientists. So that will go to show you the level of political leadership here. And as Sheila Jakababota said, we are the leaders we are waiting for. We need to do this. We need to get up and change this. And I'm really hoping that you can join us on that journey. And perhaps you're already doing it. And this is where I'm really interested to hear what you've been doing within your various universities already. But with that, I'll hand over to, I believe, Magdalena is going next.
Or is actually, it Nathan is here already. So
okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible or? Yeah, okay. I'm sorry. I don't think I have a video. There seems to be some issue with me setting up my video, but whatever. I'll just speak. Hello. So I'm Nathan, and I'm a climate activist, I guess. I've been recently involved a bit more with some student activism, but I first kind of got involved, I suppose. Well, like I'd have participated, I suppose, in the Fridays for Future marches back in 2019, but as a sort of taking a more prominent role over COVID, I sort of got a bit involved with Extinction Rebellion. And sort of off the back of that, like around last year, around COP27, I organised a march with Extinction Rebellion and also helping out with this group in Trinity that was also in Trinity College Dublin, that was also... Okay, I think I could start my video. Hello, right, okay, good. It's good to see you. Right, so like I was saying, I got kind of involved back around over COVID, over lockdown, strangely enough. A lot of people left the environmental, like the environment movement kind of deflated a tiny bit over lockdown, but funnily enough, I did the opposite and got more involved over lockdown. So then around COP27 last year, I was organised around COP20, around COP27, there was this group in Trinity that also was aiming to hold this march around Dublin, the student group, to kind of draw attention to both the failure of the COP system as a whole, in a global sense, that it hasn't managed to like dim our emissions at all, really, and on the other hand, to draw a more closer local attention to the failures of the Irish government to act sufficiently on climate change. And I'm sure you've probably heard some of that already, but you know that we were possibly the top emitter in Europe, I think, in the second quarter of last year. So with that sort of thing, we organised this march, and it was really powerful, I think, to get all these different organisations together, because we had both the student body, and we also had these more experienced activists like Extinction Rebellion, like well, Fridays for Future are also obviously student activists, but we also had like Oxfam were there, I think, and other groups. So it was a really great day to build this kind of this collaborative thing. And then coming on from that, the group that we started there, Time to Act Trinity, has since gone on, and I've been involved with them in forming a sort of a national body on the Student Climate Crisis Coalition, is what we call it, the Student Climate Crisis Coalition, with the aim of bringing all these different student bodies together and to kind of provide a sort of a unified voice, I suppose, on the page of the climate, on the climate to add the voice of the students to the national climate, because when you look at the conversation around climate, the third level student voice has been present here and there, sort of in sort of small patches. And like we've looked at, like, say, for the example, the divestment movement was really started off in universities, and also similarly in the UK recently, there's been the whole fossil-free research movement, which has also been an incredibly powerful movement. But we're looking more at trying to bring all these different disparate groups that are working on these same issues and trying to bring all these third level voices together, with the aim of kind of, you know, amplifying it and working with each other and collaborating with each other, which I think is a really important part of activism, is that it is a collaborative enterprise more than an individualistic enterprise, because every individual can only, I suppose, do so much and has their certain backgrounds, and only if we can acknowledge all these different backgrounds intersecting and all these different perspectives, I think it's only when we acknowledge all of that and we work together that we can properly start to build bridges and build momentum towards a better future. So yeah, so that's kind of my background. I suppose in a way, what's written on this screen here, that action is the best antidote to despair, I found that was really powerful for me, because I remember as a child, when I was like 10, 11, I remember once I read this piece on what was it on? It was just a little booklet that was like here's what's going to happen with each degree of warming. It was on like the back of one of those like carbon counter, add up your emissions type things, which I think since then I've kind of realized we need more collective action than sort of focusing on our individual lifestyles. Our individual lifestyles are important too, particularly in the aspects of our diets and our traveling. We need to cut down on our flights and things. I think that is important. But I think in general, what's more powerful is the collective action. But anyway, back then when I was around 10, 11, I was reading the back of this little this emission counter, and it just went through the 5 degrees of warming, and at each degree of warming, and I remember reading the bottom one after the 5th degree, like with the mounting sense of sort of dread, and that it was getting worse and worse, and the bottom one I think said, and this was quite scary as a child, like as someone who was only young and didn't really, I suppose, understand that much, to read the last one say the survival of the species of humans, like the survival of the human species, is in question beyond 5 degrees Celsius of warming. And I just remember reading that and being so terrified and running, like I burst into tears, I think, and I sort of started crying, which was really frightening, I suppose. And through the years, I've kind of continued to feel that thing, and it kind of, in a way, it sometimes felt a bit isolating as well. I think I'd say that, like, by feeling as though you have this really scary thing that you're confronting, and the fact that most people seem to be able to get on with their day-to-day lives and get on fine with that is a really sort of a frightening sense some of the time, like that and I remember that sort of sense of despair, and just it continued until I think I was around 16, 17 or thereabouts, like that. Every now and again I just had these moments when I'd get so stressed just thinking about the next 30 years or whatever, and by 2050 what will this world be like? By even, I suppose, at first it was like, what will 2020 even look like? And I think we have seen some bad effects since then. Sorry, I think I'm talking an awful lot. But yeah, and I think that by moving from this sort of this individualized fright towards a collective action, and I think that's what makes stuff really powerful when people come together. And I've certainly felt a lot less stressed about it as soon as I started taking action, and as soon as I started working on climate issues, I suppose. So that's something, and I think it's really important that this also happens within universities, because universities are places where there is a lot of thinking, there's a lot of argument, there's a lot of debate, and they've historically as well been these great motivators for social change, and that's part of the rationale behind the Student Climate Crisis Coalition, is that in the past, when it comes to say, for example, in Trinity, Wolfe Tone was a member of the Trinity Debating Society, and he was there. And so, in other parts of history, I mean, one thinks back, I suppose, in America to the civil rights movement, that was also had a very big university element, a very big third level institutional element. So I think historically there's always been this idea of debating, of questioning our society and thinking about our society in universities. And I think both as student bodies, we need to do this, but also as academic centres, I think universities need to push for more change. So, for example, I'm pushing in Trinity to get them to adopt the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and to endorse that publicly. So, as an academic centre, if they endorse this treaty, it sends a message to society, and I think that's really important. Right. So, I think that's I've spoken a lot there. So, I think I'll hand back to Ian.
I think I might go next.
Oh, sorry, Magdalena.
Yeah, no worries. Hello, my name is Magdalena. I'm 21 years old. I'm also engaged in climate activism. As Nathan, I'm a student. I'm a student of TU Dublin, so another branch of TU. Yes. So young people these days grow up in troubled times, I would say. It's a time of crises. We always hear housing crisis, energy crisis, COVID crisis, war in the Ukraine. So it's really not easy. At times we know, as Naomi mentioned, climate change is serious. It is dangerous. It means natural disasters, political instability, and it is multiplying injustice. The situation is very urgent. The public knows so much, and for me, I started this journey when in 2020 and 2019, when I saw people going on the streets about this climate crisis. Some people on the streets, or some people went on the streets, and it was a big movement. And I, like many people, I felt like we do understand how serious and dangerous this is, but still not enough is happening. So this was my reason to get engaged with Fridays for Future then. Fridays for Future is the school striker movement founded and started by Greta Thunberg. Now it's a big movement all around the world. There are thousands of activists in different places, and we are still very much active. We are still there and doing a lot of work. Yes. And there I work towards effective and just climate action. Now, as what is the role for Irish universities in this climate crisis? There are certain points that I would like to give you along on this journey. What we just heard, it's scary, and it has big impacts on our lives, on our futures, as well as on our presence. But there are things that we can do. And I'm sure, and I am still continuing to do this job because I think there are solutions and there is a way of us getting out of this way and constructing a society that is better than the one which in which we are now. The first point is, I think, in order to do something about this climate crisis, I'm convinced it needs community. You might have heard the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. So I think the same stands for this climate emergency. We need to do this together. Nobody will do it alone. The media sometimes tells us this one person is the like Greta Thunberg is this big role model and she has changed so many things. Actually, there has been a climate movement since the 90s and before that have advocating for climate change. So there are many people working on this. I'm very glad and happy to meet so many people who are engaged in this in my daily activism. There are scientists who hold the solutions. There are politicians, some politicians who started working on this. We have seen some changes since 2020 and changes starting to happen. We are going against this slowly, but there is something happening. Then, as Naomi touched on before, we need to, in this community, we need to speak with honesty. So it is important to speak about where we are and how quick this has to happen. And then further on the role of Irish universities, if you would ask me what should Irish universities do about the climate crisis, what should you as educators do, I would give you the answer, educate people on the climate crisis, young citizens on the climate crisis, and educate yourself. We are in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. The climate crisis is a very unjust phenomenon. We know that people in other parts of the world, in small island states or in Africa, are more threatened by the climate crisis than we are right now. So this is what we mean when we say climate justice as activists, to think of those people while we are like in solving this climate crisis here in Ireland. It reproduces inequality. It has negative impacts on emancipation of women. Last week was International Women's Day, so it does those problems are interconnected, and that is what we look out for. You might hear us say at our protest, system change, not climate change. When I first heard this phrase, it seemed a bit scary to me, to be honest, because changing a whole system seems so big and terrifying. What we say what we mean when we say that is that we step by step have to change the way how society works to get to a carbon neutral future, as well as solving those inequalities and thinking about who is being impacted by our economy, and who the climate crisis threatens the most. How can we effectively bring down emissions to stop global warming as well? Yeah, and last but not least, what can you do now? Let's not end up in despair, I would say. I'm in this because I think there is a way out. I get to see the solutions, get to know people who work on this. And I would ask you in here, feel free to get engaged. I can give you some personal examples of those people, maybe so to make it more, that you can understand this more. So I'm personally involved with Fridays for Future. I texted them on Instagram, and now we have weekly meetings. We organize strikes and educational events around the climate crisis. We do a lot of political engagement. So going to government forums, speaking to politicians. We protest politicians, and we do climate advocacy. So we talk about the climate crisis and try to spread the word. One more example from my daily life. Every Friday, we stand outside the government in Ireland, and from 1 to 2 p.m., I must say that's one of the best parts of my week, because there is that sense of community there. And from there, a woman who also lives in the same suburb that I live asked me if I didn't want to come to her house sometime this week, because she wanted to set up a movie screening. And then she invited 5 other people, old men from the village, who also came along, and together we organized a movie screening. And in the end, 90 people came to see this climate movie. 90 people came to talk about this climate crisis. So I think it very much, action can happen. People are interested in this, but we need to do this together. It's not about being perfect. It's about doing what we can, and forum groups learn about this, talk about this, and get engaged. Thank you so much.
Is my audio coming through okay?
Yep, yes it is.
Thank you. So I'm Ian. I'm an ex-professional scientist, and I'm a very active member of Scientist Rebellion in Ireland and internationally. So I'm just going to go through what that is and then try and convince you to consider joining us. So Scientist Rebellion is just like Extinction Rebellion. It's a non-violent direct action group, aka non-violent civil disobedience. So what Gandhi did. It started about 2 years ago, and there were about 1,000 scientists striking at the same time internationally, about 100 of whom were arrested. So it is often orientated towards arrest, but you don't need to be willing to get arrested to join. In Ireland, we're pretty small. We just kind of started late last year, and we're in the single digits of membership. But yeah, please consider joining. So I'd say anyone with a Bachelor's of Science or any other scientific qualification should join Scientist Rebellion, and anyone else maybe Extinction Rebellion. And the distinction isn't like functionally different. We're just saying the same things as Extinction Rebellion and equally validly. It's just slightly harder for some people to dismiss things that are being said by scientists, even though Extinction Rebellion is saying things that have been scientific consensus for my whole life. So here's a few pictures of Scientist Rebellion actions. The top left there is Peter Kalmus, who's sort of a semi-celebrity in the space now. He's an ex-NASA scientist, and he chained himself to Chase Bank there, I think it was. And the top right, I'm in that one there somewhere. That was in Berlin last year. We got all of the Scientist Rebellion chapters all into Germany for a week of action, because we didn't really have numbers at a national level to have strong enough nation level protests. But this bottom right picture is just the Dutch chapter last week, so they've managed to get up to 100 members. So we're really rocketing in membership. So hoping to do the same thing in Ireland. An informal tagline of the movement is, if you say that the house is on fire, but you just keep sitting there and drinking tea, then why would anyone believe you? So we as a scientific community are saying things are real bad, but if we just keep sitting in our ivory towers doing research, we're not really conveying the panic, we're not really communicating what we're saying. And this big old block of text is just evidence-based justification for our methods. So on top of the historic precedents of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and their respective movements, this researcher, Erica Chenoweth, studied hundreds of uprisings, non-violent uprisings, and found that virtually no regime withstood participation of just 3.5% of the population. And even when it was just one person in 1,000 joining a non-violent movement, it succeeded nearly half the time. So when we're going out and making a fuss, getting ourselves arrested, or doing less radical protests, there is good reason to believe that it is worth doing. And even if it isn't, I can at least say to my niece in 20 years, I gave it a go. Blame everyone else, please, and not me. Which is just one reason to do it. And so, yes, Scientist Rebellion. I'll add contact details in here. I think that's all I had. Apart from, let's see. This is one particularly scary slide that is often used. So some people, devil's advocate, will say, isn't it our job to kind of just do the research and the job of other people to implement it? But this graph charts the carbon dioxide in the air against a timeline of the various political conferences that have spoken about climate change and made agreements about what to do. So it just keeps going up and up and up, and all of these various different protocols and conferences just are not working. So it's worth a go. So that is the end of our presentation. I'm going to leave these contact details up on the slide in case anyone is interested in joining any of the movements. If you don't have the time or energy towards Scientist Rebellion or Extinction Rebellion, then Friends of the Earth is at least worth doing. They have extremely low effort campaigns, sort of targeted lobbying, where they just say, click this button to send an email to this politician saying, stop watering down that climate legislation. So I think we are happy to take questions at this point, Dermot.
Yep. Thank you very much to all our speakers. That was amazing. Went very heart-touching and covered so much there. I'd just like to tell everyone, yeah, feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We have 2 questions already. First from Vicky. I'm a PhD student studying the social barriers to plant-forward diets with children. Unless we shift to plant-forward diets, we cannot reach climate targets. Animal agriculture is the greatest cause of biodiversity loss and a key contributor to carbon emissions. I want to see universities shift to offering plant-based catering as the default. How important / impactful do you think such an initiative would be, and how can we encourage such a shift? So whoever would like to tackle that.
I might throw in one point before, if anyone else has anything to add after that. Scientist Rebellion got a leaked version of the last IPCC report. So I'm under the impression that the IPCC report is first written by a scientific cohort and is then adapted into more politically savory language, i.e. it's just watered down. In the non-watered down version, there was an assertion that if just 10 to 30% of the population makes social changes, for example, switching to a vegetarian diet, we can expect to see social tipping points. So it's certainly, and of course, if you make something easier for people to do, then more people will do it. So yeah, I fervently agree with this person's point.
Can I just add to that, Ian, as well? I think this is where it's really interesting to look at. There's another group that I work with. So I work with lots of different groups, and one of them is Doctors for the Irish Environment, which is a group of surgeons and doctors based in Ireland who became so concerned with the level of ecological collapse as well as humanitarian crisis that they were seeing. Things like the crisis of diabetes, it's hugely problematic, and our healthcare system can already not cope in terms of both the pandemic as well as decades of systemic problems. So I think it's a really great question. And I think it's something that absolutely could be discussed within the university, and perhaps to reference the Doctors for the Irish Environment. I know they presented in the Oireachtas recently in terms of the impacts that plant-based diets could have, and how it could just be a quick win in terms of institutional change that can really have a big impact.
If also I could, can I speak? Can you hear me yet?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, no, I just also wanted to jump in quickly because I think it is a really important thing. And I remember reading, I think recently, it's there's in Germany, I think in Berlin, they have switched to a largely vegan. I think about 60 or 70% of their diet is vegan in university canteens in Berlin. So there is a push for it, and I think that we have seen a bit of a shift, not a fast enough shift towards plant-based diets. But I think it is something that we need to ask for more within universities, because I think that there is a broad sort of sway of support. Like I remember in Trinity, for example, I was talking to a professor who just carried out a survey, and I suppose I can't really discuss the results of the survey, but they did show a much higher level of support for that sort of initiative, and there often is a much higher level of support for moving to more plant-based diets, for putting up solar panels than you would guess. So like there are a lot of people out there who would support it. You just kind of have to ask, I think, and there has to be a push for that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question, is there anything specific to community colleges that I can do before I transfer? What kind of questions can I ask my community college to find out how they are reacting / not reacting to the climate crisis? So that's from Marina. So I presume that's someone who is about to move to a university, isn't in university yet. But I suppose the question is, what questions can you start raising no matter where you are, what level of what education institute you're in? Magdalena?
Hello, Marina. Thank you for the question. That's a good question. What can you do in your college, in your environment? I did something. I once asked a lecturer of mine in the university, because we have a like a general education. I'm studying music, but we have a general education module where we go through more society focused topics, and I just asked him, hey, could we maybe talk about the climate? And then he picked it up and actually talked about the climate with us for an hour, and it was very successful, and many people were very engaged. So I would generally just recommend you start asking, can we talk about this? Maybe ask them, is there an environmental group in this college, or do you know anything? Sometimes, yeah, or in the community college, sometimes they are involved with green schools or have green committees. Just start asking. If you want to find out more about what your college is doing, then you can definitely also ask them, where does our energy come from? Why don't we have, or why is there, where does this food come from that we get in the college? Start asking the questions that you're interested in, and also I would advise, or I would suggest you to find people that you can talk about those things about, maybe read a book together and talk to the people around you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yep, Neve asks, can engineers join Scientists Rebellion?
Absolutely.
Ian.
Very welcome. Yeah. Very welcome to both groups.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry. More technical stuff there. Okay. from Mary, can we see more student leadership by having a climate officer role in Students' Union, as there is an Irish language officer in some unis? Has this ever been discussed? So I don't know if that's a wider.
I'm actually a college officer in students in the TU Dublin Students' Union, and I have been very surprised to find out that there is no climate or sustainability related officer role within the National Students' Union USI. I think there is only one college, which is UCD, who has an environmental officer. In TU Dublin, this will come in place in the next year. Generally, there is a lot of capacity and room for climate activism and climate engagement in students' unions. And if you are in this position, if you are a student, please push for it. Please get engaged. Feel free to get in contact with me. I have been working on this, but also feel free to join the Student Climate Crisis Coalition that we've talked about before. There we have a network out of third level students who are in environmental or who are environmentally engaged. And yes.
Thank you. In regards to the question about plant-based diets, are you in contact with the UK plant-based universities? So I don't know if that's a question for you or for us in MTU, but maybe you can answer from your experience.
I hadn't heard of them personally.
Yeah, if that person could maybe list some of them, we could.
There is, I think, University College Cork have a strong vegan society, and they have a seminar next weekend, or rather the weekend after, on plant-based diets, and I think they are in contact with the UK, with a UK network. I've heard them speak about similar things before.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we'll try and find out about more about UK based universities. From Mary, COVID officers were appointed during COVID crisis. Surely there should be a climate officer for both staff and students in universities. There's a lot of nodding heads there. I think that's something we can all agree on.
I mean, yeah, in Trinity, they have recently appointed a vice provost for biodiversity and sustainability. And I think that, like, even within the university, you can see that there has been a lot of positive change from appointing someone to that role. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I know in MTU, we're still working on our structures, but there is definitely going to be a sustainability team put place. We don't know what that's going to look like yet, but there will be definitely, hopefully, someone of a high level that can progress things.
Can I just add to that, Dermot? I think it's really interesting the stage of your organization is at. I used to be an organization development and a corporate developer. And it's really a great opportunity for you to embed sustainability in every part of the organization. So while it's important to have an action officer, it's also important that everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet. The research that I referenced on the sociocultural change, I couldn't go through it all because it would take me 3 or 4 hours. But one of the key recommendations from that research, and I'm happy to share the wider deck with people, but one of the key recommendations was that HEIs have a mandatory sustainability training, and that it's at the forefront of every course, irrespective of whether it's economics, because of course economics is also a sustainable issue, or whether it's environmental science or social science. It needs to be centered in and embedded in every part, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yep.
And in a way, I'll just kind of jump in there. Yeah, like that, we also, in universities as well, there is also this idea as well coming up that we should have a mandatory climate education modules for students too, and that should be part of our education going forward, because we are going to have to cope with the world that will be changing, and that is going to change, and we need to have the skills to adapt to that. And in Barcelona already, they have I think is the first place in the world that they've adopted this model of having a mandatory climate module, but I think it definitely should be something that should be expanded.
Oh yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yeah, that's the last of the questions. I'm just going to check the chat. Yep, that's everyone, unless anyone wants to ask another quick question there.
One more point on the last question, maybe. In TU Dublin, there is also a new sustainability department, which are setting up a climate action plan currently. And I think it's great. There are not enough people working on sustainability in Irish universities, from my personal perception, and it's great that this is being that it becomes more. I think 2 points, it will be important to speed up those efforts if you're in a position that you can do this. And the second point is maybe question whether you want to call it sustainability, or if you want to make it focus it more around the climate, because I do think that calling it the sustainability department or talking about sustainability versus climate action towards students makes a difference. Sustainability can water down things when you talk to students. It describes different efforts. Sustainability is also important, but just be cautious of making that decision for the name of your department.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mary has another question. Public service obligation to address SDGs will help with addressing climate. It's been talked about, at least. I know there's a push here now to incorporate SDGs a lot more and embed those, and obviously that does cover biodiversity and climate and human rights and everything. So it's, yeah, I think that can make a help.
I mean,
What is it?
In Wales, I think they have an officer for future generations, which works with which is a new role in Wales that they've got in the government that works with to put future generations' rights as dictated by the SDGs and try to implement them, which I think is really interesting. So if there's similar initiatives in Ireland, though the SDGs are obviously quite a complicated framework, and they, in my view, do have flaws too, particularly in terms of their focus on economic growth, which I think is something that we also need to challenge. But nonetheless, yes.
I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to add to that really quickly. The SDGs, yeah, they do. As a sustainable development scientist, I would absolutely agree with Nathan's point about they definitely need to be reviewed. And often when we bring in frameworks into institutions, people can get so bogged down in the framework that the action doesn't actually happen. So I would they're great to have as a reference point, but equally, don't get too caught up in them. And it's interesting, there have been a set of inner development goals that have been launched, which actually we've seen as development scientists, we've seen more development when we push inner development goals first, because it causes transformation from within. And there's a peer-to-peer kind of knock-on effect. There's a domino effect. When one person sees somebody taking action, they're like, oh, should I be doing that as well? So there's lots of ways to approach it.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, and Mary came back, she said, yeah, they're definitely flawed. Another question from Peter. Thank you all for the inspiring talks, especially to Naomi and Ian. As someone working in academia, I can feel how it can feel frustrating when we do not see the science reflected in the real world.
I hear you, Peter. I hear you. I mean, frustration is, I think Ian and I have spoken about this a lot in terms of it can be hard to just, particularly hard for my mental health, if I'm honest, where, you can often feel like you're being gaslit. Like people don't understand the gravitas of the situation. And that's why I've started referring to like my 9-year-old godchild, because she knows more and she's willing to talk about this more frankly than many adults that I meet. And in that sense, it's very hard for people to argue with a 9-year-old child's perspective. And it's interesting as scientists, and sorry, I'll just make this one point. We have found that from a social science perspective, for people to enact change, they need to hear real world evidence. And if we tell them data points, only 2 out of 5 people will remember what I've said. If I tell them a story, 4 out of 5 people will remember what I've said. So it's doubly effective. And I think that's where, as scientists perhaps, and as academics, you know, we need to change the narrative a bit and think about how can we make this into a human story.
Totally agree.
A serious thanks to MTU and Dermot from all of us, because, you know, institutions like to see activists more as pariahs, and you're really kind of making that change.
Well, I'm also a union rep, so I know that feeling too. Mary Burke has said another question here. We cannot change unless we are moved to change. The power of storytelling. Thank you, Naomi, and all. Hope to continue this conversation. I think that's the most important thing. We do need to continue this conversation and keep this conversation going. So, Ian, you shared some contact details, obviously for anyone in MTU. If they want to send stuff to me as well, I can hopefully send them on and you know, keep this conversation going and hopefully widen it as well. So, thank you so much to our speakers and to everyone who joined. We had a great response. I think it took a short enough time, we think, before we got everyone together. So we got a lot of people there to attend, and I'm really grateful for everyone who attended, and to our speakers, and to Mary Jo and Carol, who helped organize this and set it up. And we had a couple of technical issues, but hopefully we've surmounted them. And I'll check now that this has recorded in a roundabout way, and hopefully should set it on to everyone. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Bye bye. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.